The second day of spring brought Clara down a lonely trail, a place where the wind did nothing but scrape dust across the old fence lines. She rode slow, her pony was old, limping with a lifetime of miles, and the bow across her back felt more like a memory than a weapon. For years, folks in town had called her strange. They whispered that she was cursed, or maybe just forgotten by God and man. She'd stopped caring a long time ago. The quiet hills west of San Saba were enough for her. They were distant. They had no eyes to watch her. But that morning the quiet broke. At first she thought it was just another scarecrow, a ragged thing leaning crooked against a fence post, something a rancher put up and forgot. Then her eyes focused. She saw the raw, angry edges of barbed wire. And it wasn't biting into cloth. It was biting into human skin. A boy, barely a man, hung there like a broken doll. No shoes on his feet, no name on his lips. His arms were stretched out behind him, twisted at an unnatural angle, his face a mask of crusted blood. His chest rose, just barely, but it rose. He was still alive. The coyotes hadn't gotten to him yet, but the buzzards were already circling low, their great black wings blotting out the morning sun. 3 of them were already sitting on the rail, bold and patient, just waiting. Clara slid from her saddle before she could think better of it. She wasn't in the habit of stopping for strangers, least of all for white boys left for dead on some rancher's claim. But something in the way his eyes cracked open, unfocused and just resigned, it struck her somewhere deep, a place she thought had turned to stone years ago. She worked the wire with practiced fingers, careful not to tear his skin any further, but swift enough to make the buzzards rethink their morning meal. He didn't flinch. He just sagged into her hands, a dead weight of pain and exhaustion. She cupped the back of his head, tipping water from her canteen against his split lips. He stirred, his mouth moving but making no sound. She answered for him anyway, her voice low, first in the old Comanche words, then in English. "You're not dead," she said. "That means you're still meant for something." She hadn't meant to stop for him. Clara hadn't meant to stop for anyone in 27 winters. Not since the night her whole world burned to the ground. Not since soldiers and their dogs had torn through the camp, leaving her with nothing but the sound of her sisters' bodies hitting the frozen earth. She had run then, barefoot and bleeding, until the hills finally gave her cover. Since that night she had lived like a shadow. She'd trade hides for cornmeal once a month, speaking to no one. She kept her fire low so the smoke wouldn't give her away. People in town called her a witch, or worse, a ghost just waiting for the good sense to die. They weren't entirely wrong. She had stopped expecting to save anyone, and she sure as hell had stopped expecting to be saved. But now there was this boy, thrown away like trash, left to rot on a wire fence. She couldn't walk away. She just couldn't. She carried him slung over her shoulder like a sack of firewood, taking it one slow step at a time, back to the small hidden hut she'd built near a creek where the water always ran cold. Inside, she stoked the fire until the smoke clung to the low rafters. She boiled herbs in a clay pot, yarrow for the bleeding, sage for cleansing the spirit, and then she carefully stripped his torn shirt away. What she found beneath the blood and dirt made her go still. His skin was a road map of suffering. There were raised angry welts from a heavy belt, long thin cuts from a whip, and deep, dark bruises on his wrists and ankles that told of shackles pulled too tight for far too long. This wasn't the body of a boy who was simply punished for a crime. This was the body of someone who had been systematically broken, someone trained to endure pain, as if endurance itself was the only thing demanded of him. She wondered what kind of monster would do this to a child, and she wondered why. She cleaned him slowly, pouring cool river water over his chest, wiping away the grime and blood with the soft inner bark of a cottonwood tree. When he shivered, she covered him with a heavy deer hide. When he vomited up the thin broth she'd spooned between his lips, she held his head steady and said nothing. When he whimpered in his fever dreams, she let the crackle of the fire be her only answer. She knew that some wounds were too deep for words to touch. By the third night, his breathing had steadied, though his body was still a limp weight of exhaustion. Just before the dawn, he stirred. His eyes were half open, fixed on the smoke curling toward the ceiling. His voice, when it came, was like the rasp of dry grass. "Am I dead?" Clara didn't answer right away. She just poured water into a carved wooden bowl and lifted it to his mouth. He drank, coughed, then blinked at her, his eyes still dazed and clouded with pain. "Why? Why did you help me?" he managed to ask. She studied him for a long time. This boy with another man's blood still on his face and a terrible resignation in his gaze. Then she said in clear English, so he couldn't possibly mistake her meaning, "Because you looked like you didn't care if I did or not." The words struck him harder than the water in his throat. His lips trembled, but he didn't try to deny it. He just stared into the fire. After a long, heavy silence, he whispered a question that seemed to be torn from the deepest part of him. "Why did they leave me?" Clara didn't answer that either. She didn't need to. The scars on his back already told half the story. The emptiness in his eyes filled in the rest. To say it out loud would only cut deeper into flesh that hadn't even begun to heal. So she kept her silence, letting the fire pop and the wind rattle the roof, while the boy drifted back into an uneasy sleep. She hadn't saved him because he was hers to save. She had saved him because she knew exactly what it felt like to be abandoned by the world, and she knew what it cost a person to decide to live anyway. By the fifth morning, the boy, who she had started calling Thomas in her own mind, tried to rise on his own. His legs trembled under him, buckling before he could take even 2 steps. He cursed under his breath, his teeth clenched against the fresh wave of pain. Clara watched him from her stool by the fire. Her tone was calm, but it was edged with a certainty that cut through the air. "Stop proving you are weak by rushing," she said. He looked up, startled. No one had ever spoken to him like that. Not with scorn, not with pity, but with a kind of authority that expected, and deserved, to be listened to. He wanted to argue, to spit back that he wasn't weak, but his own body betrayed him, collapsing back onto the deer-hide pallet. The shame burned hotter than his lingering fever. "I'm not weak," he muttered to the floor. Clara's gaze was steady, unblinking. "Then wait," she said. "Strength listens before it moves." The words silenced him more than any rebuke ever could have. He'd been told his whole life what he wasn't. Not obedient enough, not white enough, not quiet enough. But no one had ever suggested that his spirit might still be in there somewhere, listening. He lay back, the words echoing in his mind, and for the first time he actually listened to the pain in his body, not as an enemy to be fought, but as a story to be understood. Later that day, as dusk painted the inside of the hut in shades of amber, he spoke again. His voice was low and raw. "I don't have a name." Clara tilted her head, a flicker of curiosity in her dark eyes. "Everyone has a name. Once." "Not me," he said, staring at the fire. "My folks just called me boy. The ranchers, they called me half-breed. My master." His voice trailed off, heavy with memories that were still too sharp to touch. He looked away, ashamed. Clara didn't press him. She just let the silence sit between them. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice simple and clear. "You were born. You bled. You're still alive. That means you deserve a name." His eyes flicked toward her, searching her face for something, though he wasn't sure what. "You going to give me one?" She shook her head slowly. "No, but when you've earned it, I'll tell you the moment I hear it." For the first time since she'd cut him down from that fence, Thomas almost believed he might actually live long enough to earn one. He felt a tiny, fragile seed of hope take root in the barren soil of his soul. But he had no idea that the men who put him on that fence weren't the type to leave a job unfinished. And they were coming back. The knock wasn't a knock at all. It was 3 sharp, violent crashes of a boot against the flimsy hut door. It was the kind of sound that carried a threat long before any words were spoken. Thomas stiffened, every muscle in his body remembering that sound, remembering the pain that always followed it. Clara rose slowly, her long braids hanging loose against her shoulders. She didn't hurry, she didn't flinch. She just moved with a deliberate calm that seemed to push back against the violence at her door. Outside, 2 men stood waiting. One of them remained in the saddle, a double-barreled shotgun resting easy across his lap, his eyes cold and flat. The other, a big, red-bearded man with boots that were too polished for actual ranch work, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt and smirked. "You're her?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "The old Comanche witch." Clara gave him nothing, no answer, no nod. Just a silent, steady gaze. He jerked his chin toward the hut. "That boy inside, he's not yours." "I never said he was," she replied, her voice as even and cool as the creek water. "Well, he ain't ours any more, neither," the man sneered. "That's what the wire was for. Should have left him for the buzzards. Would have saved us the ride out here." The man on the horse chuckled, a dark, ugly sound. "You took in a rabid dog, Comanche," the rider said. Clara's eyes didn't shift from the bearded man. "I've seen rabid dogs," she said. "They foam at the mouth, they bite. This one only breathes." The bearded man took a step closer, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. His voice roughened. "He stole from us. A horse, liquor, caused a whole mess of trouble. He was broken property. We broke him. Should have just killed him clean." He lifted his gun, just an inch, just enough to change the air between them. Inside, Thomas pressed his back against the door, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. His body was shaking, but for the first time in his life, it wasn't from fear. It was something deeper. A cold, hard rage, tangled up with a terrifying new sense of purpose. He could hear every word, and every word was a lie. Clara's voice stayed calm, cutting through his anger. "No one owns him now," she said. "He's not yours to keep. He was never yours to break." The man sneered, his face twisting with contempt. "Lady, this ain't no tribal campfire story. This is Texas. And in Texas, harboring a thief means you hang right alongside him." Before Clara could answer, a new voice cut through the tension. It was raw, unsteady, but it burned with a fire that surprised everyone, most of all, Thomas himself. "If you touch her," he said, "I'll gut you where you stand." The 2 men turned. Thomas was standing in the doorway, his legs shaking but holding. In his hands, he was gripping Clara's old skinning blade with more raw will than actual skill. His eyes blazed, not with fear, but with a pure, defiant hatred. "You think I don't remember?" He spat at the red-bearded man. "You think I don't remember the nights you tied me to the post, out back like an animal? You think I don't remember the feel of your boots on my ribs?" The man shifted his weight, his lips curling in disdain, but there was a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the broken thing to fight back. Clara lifted her hand just slightly. Her voice was pure iron. "Try it," she said. "Please." The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. The rider shifted nervously in his saddle. The red-bearded man spat again, trying to mask his hesitation with bravado. He looked from Clara's unyielding face to the boy's burning eyes and seemed to make a calculation. "Keep him," he finally grunted. "We'll just say the coyotes took him." With that, they turned their horses and rode off. They weren't defeated, not exactly, but they left with the bitter knowledge that they hadn't won. Not this time. As their figures disappeared over the ridge, Thomas dropped the blade. His chest heaved as if the weight of the entire world had just been lifted off of him. He collapsed against the frame of the door, his strength gone. Clara knelt beside him, her hand steady on his shoulder. "You were ready to fight them," she said softly. "You would have died." He nodded, sweat dripping into his eyes. "Yes, and you let me." Her gaze held his. "Because you didn't need me to save you," she said, her voice clear and true. "You needed to decide for yourself that you were worth saving." The words sank into him like cool water into parched earth. For the first time, Thomas understood. Freedom wasn't something someone else gave you. It wasn't a gift. It was something you had to claim for yourself, even if it cost you everything. And as he looked out at the empty trail where his tormentors had been, he felt a flicker of something new. It wasn't happiness, it wasn't peace, it was power. But he had no idea that the ranchers weren't his real problem. The story they told about him, the story of a common thief, was a lie. And the real reason they wanted him dead was far worse than a stolen horse. It was a secret that had already gotten one man killed, and the law itself was coming to bury it. Thomas's body healed slowly, but his spirit healed faster. Each sunrise seemed to bring a new layer of strength, a little less shadow in his eyes. At first his steps were clumsy, his hands still shaking when he tried to hold a bow. But Clara never mocked him. She handed him snares and showed him how to set them near the rabbit trails, her patience as steady as the stones in the creek bed as he fumbled with the knots. By the second week, he could draw water from the creek without stumbling. He even brought back a fish, small, crooked, but caught with his own hand. It was a victory. Each evening they sat by the fire, the silence between them becoming comfortable. Thomas started asking questions. Endless questions about the land, about the birds, about why she shaped the fire pit in a perfect circle. Clara often answered with just a few words, but those words carried the weight of a lifetime. "Listen before you believe," she told him one morning as he watched a hawk circle overhead. He grinned. It was the first real grin she'd seen on his face since she'd cut him from the fence. It wasn't the grin of a boy, and it wasn't the grin of someone proud. It was just human. A simple, honest expression of being alive. One night, as the smoke from the fire drifted up toward the stars, Thomas finally asked a question that had been clawing at the back of his mind. What do the Comanche call someone who doesn't belong anywhere? Clara stirred the stew in the pot, her eyes on the flames. "We don't," she replied softly. "Even ghosts belong to someone." The answer struck him like a stone tossed into a still pond, sending ripples out in ways he couldn't yet name or understand. For the first time in his life, he started to wonder if belonging wasn't something that was given to you, but something you had to claim. The days passed with a quiet, steady rhythm. Life was simple, it was hard, but it was his. Then at sunset one evening Clara saw it. Smoke on the ridge. Not the lazy drift of a campfire. These were sharp, deliberate puffs of smoke that no accident could ever make. Her stomach tightened into a cold knot. This wasn't Comanche smoke. It wasn't Apache. It was military, U.S. cavalry, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were hunting someone. They were hunting him. The ranchers hadn't given up. They had just sent bigger dogs. The next morning she woke him before dawn. She handed him a small bundle of dried sage. "Go to the river bend," she said, her voice urgent. "Check the traps again." "We checked them yesterday," he protested, still shaking off sleep. "Check. Again," she commanded. Her eyes held his, telling him more than her words ever could. "If you see men in uniform, burn this. The smoke will be different. I'll see it." He nodded, the simple gravity of her tone chasing away his confusion. He took the sage and left, melting into the pre-dawn shadows. By midday they came, 7 men in dust-stained blue coats, riding with the kind of easy authority that, to Clara, looked no different from the arrogance of wolves. The officer in charge dismounted. He was tall and thin-faced, with a pale mustache and eyes that seemed to see everything as either an obstacle or a possession. "Afternoon," he said, his voice polite but empty of warmth. "We're looking for an escaped prisoner. Young, white, mixed blood. He's dangerous. Attacked a rancher, stole a horse, possibly unstable." Clara crossed her arms, her face a mask of stone. "Name?" The officer shifted his weight, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "He has no legal name. Might go by Jesse or Eli, or nothing at all." Her gaze was like flint. "Lots of boys in this world without names." "Not like this one," the officer pressed, his polite tone wearing thin. "He's a threat. To you, to the law." Clara's voice cut through the air, clean and sharp. "The law has sharp teeth when it's afraid." The officer took a step closer, his hand coming to rest on the butt of his pistol. His voice dropped, becoming a low threat. "This boy killed a man. He shot a corporal in the back." Clara's eyes did not waver. She held his gaze and asked a question that seemed to hang in the air like a razor blade. "Before or after you tied him to a fence?" For the first time, the man's mask of authority cracked. He glanced back at his men, then back at her, his jaw tightening. "You're harboring a federal criminal." "No," Clara said firmly, her voice ringing with a truth that was older than any of their laws. "I'm protecting a boy who was left for the buzzards. A boy who now feeds himself and asks good questions." "He's not your people," the officer snarled. "He is now." The words hung heavy in the silent air. The cavalry did not attack. Not yet. They withdrew to the ridge, setting up a camp within sight of her hut, waiting, watching, like hawks circling their prey. For 2 days their campfires burned on the horizon, a constant, glowing threat. But Thomas never returned to the hut. Clara had trained him well. He slept under the dense branches of pine trees, moved through the brush like a shadow. He watched them. He waited. And he learned their routines. On the 3rd night, Thomas acted. He crawled low across the rocky ridge, silent as a fox in the night. In his hand was a small leather pouch, filled with crushed yarrow and a few other herbs Clara had given him, herbs that calmed the spirit but tormented the gut. The soldiers slept, their snores rising and falling like a lazy tide. He moved from their packs to their supplies, sprinkling the fine green powder into their coffee satchel, into their water skins. Then he slipped back into the darkness, a ghost they never even knew was there. By morning they drank their coffee without suspicion. By noon their bellies were cramping, their faces turning a pale, sickly green. Some of them doubled over behind trees. Others just groaned in the grass, too weak to move. They were soldiers of the United States Army, armed with rifles and regulations. But they were no match for the quiet cunning of a boy who had once been broken and left for dead. Thomas returned to Clara's hut as the sun began to set. She was already standing outside, her bow slung over her shoulder, her eyes on the horizon. "It's time to leave," she said. He did not argue. They packed light. Herbs, hides, the old skinning blade Thomas had once held against his masters, and little else. Together they rode east, past the hills, and beyond the ridge where the sickened soldiers had made their camp. They didn't speak much, but in the quiet Thomas felt something new solidifying inside him. It was resolve, not fear. He hadn't just survived. He had acted. He had chosen. He had fought back. That night, by their small, smokeless fire, Thomas stared into the flames. "I would have gone back for you," he said quietly. Clara stirred the embers with a stick. "I know," she said. "They would have killed you." "Maybe," he replied, looking up at her, "but it wouldn't have mattered." She turned her gaze to him, the firelight reflecting in her dark, ancient eyes. You didn't need me to save you from them, she said. You needed to prove to yourself that you were worth saving. Thomas let the words sink into him, heavy and true. For the first time since he could remember, he didn't feel like prey. He didn't feel like property. He felt like a person, not yet named, not yet whole, but no longer lost. Behind them, the cavalry would eventually rise, sick and weakened, uncertain whether to pursue them into the vast, unknown territory ahead. Ahead of them lay nothing certain, only the red earth of the plains and the slim possibility of a new life. Clara and Thomas moved on anyway. They had left the place where he had nearly died, and with it the last claim anyone else had on his life. Or so they thought. They didn't know that the officer, a man named Captain Thorne, wasn't just following orders. He was hunting Thomas for a very personal reason, and he was a man who never, ever gave up. He would follow them to the ends of the earth if he had to, because Thomas didn't just witness a murder. He had taken the one thing that could prove it. They left the ridge behind, moving eastward under a pale, watchful moon. The land opened up, a wide, empty expanse scarred with red stone canyons and quiet, winding gullies. Clara, who knew this land like the lines on her own hand, guided their steps to a hidden place where the cottonwood trees bent low over a gurgling creek. "Here," she said simply. Thomas nodded. He still felt like a guest in a world that she carried inside her, but he was learning its language. Together they began to build something new. With branches of cottonwood lashed together by strips of rawhide and old hides stretched tight, they raised a small lean-to against the persistent wind. Thomas chopped the poles, the axe feeling solid and real in his hands. Sweat ran down his temples, but there was a hard line of determination in his jaw. He didn't wait to be told what to do. He just worked. Clara stitched the seams with silent, practiced precision, her hands moving with the steady rhythm of someone who had survived far too many seasons alone. At night they sat by the fire. They were no longer strangers, but they weren't yet family. They were something in between, something new. It was during one of those quiet nights that Thomas finally let the words slip past the guard he kept on his heart. He had been watching the embers glow and fade, his hands cupped as if holding something fragile. "I found a turtle today," he said, his voice quiet. "Down by the creek. It was upside down, and its shell was cracked. I thought it was finished, but I flipped it back over." Clara studied him, her face unreadable in the shifting firelight. He swallowed, the next words coming harder. I think maybe I've been waiting my whole life for someone to flip me back over too. Someone to prove I wasn't just meant to die on a fence." For a long moment she said nothing. She just poked at the fire with a long stick, sending a shower of sparks up into the darkness. Then she murmured so softly he almost didn't hear it. "Then you're not the only one." From that night on, their silences felt different, less like distance and more like a shared language. They were two broken pieces of the world that had somehow found each other in the wilderness. As the spring grew deeper and the land came alive with color, Clara decided the boy was ready for a new kind of test. She reached into her worn leather bundle one evening and unwrapped a small, simple necklace. Its beads were dull with age, but they were strung in the colors of the dusk sky and the dark river stones. Her voice was soft as she held it out to him. "I made this for my brother, before the raids. He never came back." Thomas instinctively shook his head, backing away slightly. "I can't take that. It's not mine." "You're not taking it," Clara corrected gently. "You're wearing it, until you know your own name." His breath caught in his throat. Carefully, with fingers that still trembled on cold nights, he took the necklace and tied it around his neck. The smooth, cool beads felt heavy with a history he couldn't comprehend. "What did you call him?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Siddiqui," Clara answered. "It means one who listens before speaking." Thomas touched the beads gently, as if he was afraid they might turn to dust. Seems like a good thing to be. Clara only looked at him for a long while. In her eyes there was no pity, no possession. There was only a simple, profound recognition that made him straighten his back and stand a little taller. He was wearing the memory of a brother, a son, a warrior, and he would not dishonor it. But far back on the trail, Captain Thorne and his men were recovering. Thorne was not a man to be deterred by a stomach ache. He was furious. He felt humiliated. The boy and the old woman had made a fool of him. His pursuit was no longer just about duty. It was now a personal vendetta. He sent a rider back to the nearest fort with a message, embellishing the story, painting Thomas as a cunning and dangerous killer, a leader of a phantom Comanche war party. He requested more men, more supplies. He would not be stopped again. He would hunt them down, and when he found them, he would wipe them from the face of the earth. He had to. He had to get back the small leather-bound book Thomas had unknowingly taken. The book that detailed Thorne's own crimes. The book that could ruin him forever. The days that followed were harder, not because of hunger, but because Thomas refused to remain idle. A fire had been lit inside him, a desire to prove not just to Clara, but to himself, that he was more than what had been done to him. He trapped rabbits, learned to clean fish without gagging, and even carved small useful tools from cedar wood with a hand that was growing steadier each day. Clara never praised him outright. She knew that too much pride could breed carelessness, and carelessness in the wild was a death sentence. But her silence carried its own kind of approval, and he felt it. He felt it in the way she left the sharpest knife for him to use, in the way she no longer checked his snares after he'd set them. It was a language of trust, and it meant more to him than any words ever could. Then came the day of the hunt. One dawn, Thomas slipped out into the brush with the bough Clara had left, leaning against the wall of their linto. The sun was still hidden behind the eastern hills, and a cool mist laced the tall grass with silver. He moved quietly, remembering Clara's lessons about the wind, about how to step with his toes first, to make no sound. He was no longer just walking. He was becoming part of the landscape. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, burning off the mist. His muscles began to ache. He was about to give up and head back when he saw it. A young deer, small but strong, grazing at the edge of a sun-dappled clearing. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He crouched low, his movements slow and deliberate. He drew the bow, the string tight against his cheek. He remembered Clara's words, "Don't aim with your eyes, aim with your breath." He took a slow breath in, held it, and let the arrow fly. The shot was clean, truer than he could have ever expected. The deer fell. Thomas carried it back to their camp, dragging the heavy weight with muscles that burned with exhaustion, but did not falter. When he finally laid it at Clara's feet, he looked up at her, breathless, waiting for her verdict. She knelt down, ran her hand along the animal's soft fur, and studied the wound where the arrow had struck. Then she looked up at him. "That wasn't luck," she said, her voice even. He blinked, unsure. "It wasn't?" "No," Clara said, a rare, small smile touching her lips. "That was earned." That single sentence filled him with a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. It was the first thing in his entire life that he had ever truly earned for himself. That evening, as the firelight painted their camp in shades of amber and shadow, Clara disappeared into the lientou. She returned a moment later holding a small, worn scrap of old hide. It was dark and creased with age, with symbols stitched into it with a deep red thread. It looked both fragile and enduring, like Clara herself. She placed it in his hands. He stared down at it, his heart beginning to beat fast again. "What is it?" "Your name," she said simply. His throat tightened. You said you'd tell me when I earned it." "I did." He traced the intricate stitching with a trembling thumb, the symbols foreign to his eyes but familiar to his soul. So, what is it? Clara lifted her chin, her voice steady and clear, ringing with the power of an ancient truth. It says Noah. It means he who chooses where he belongs. For a long time he could only stare at the piece of hide, his lips parted but no sound coming out. Then he whispered it aloud, as if testing the shape of freedom on his tongue. Noah. This time, when he smiled, it wasn't with the nervousness of a boy unsure of his worth, or the pride of someone desperate for approval. It was a quiet, whole smile, the smile of belonging. Clara said nothing more. She didn't need to. The fire crackled between them, and the night wind seemed to carry away the last echoes of the nameless boy who had once been tied to a fence. In his place sat Noah, a young man who had earned not just a name, but the right to claim his own life. And for the first time in years, Clara felt that she too had gained something back, someone who chose to stay, someone who, like her, had decided that survival was no longer enough. They were living now, and living meant naming and choosing and belonging. But they had forgotten about Captain Thorne. He and his 20 men were not far behind. They had found the trail of the small two-pony camp, and in Thorne's hand he clutched a new warrant, one that declared Noah a fugitive, an enemy of the state, to be shot on sight. There would be no trial. There would be no justice. Thorne was coming to be the judge, jury, and executioner, all to protect his own dark secret. And he was getting closer every single day. The first hint of trouble came not as a puff of smoke on a ridge, but as a feeling, a subtle shift in the wind, a wrongness in the quiet of the woods. Clara felt it first. She had lived her life reading the signs, and the land was telling her they were being hunted again. Noah felt it too. It was a prickling on the back of his neck, a return of the old feeling of being prey. He started carrying the bow with him everywhere. An arrow always knocked. One afternoon, while checking his snares down by the creek, he found a footprint that didn't belong. It was a military boot print, deep and clear in the soft mud. And it was fresh. He raced back to the camp, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "They're here," he said, his voice low and urgent. "One man. A scout." Clara was already packing. "One man means many are close behind," she said, her movements swift and efficient. "We have to move. Now." They abandoned their camp, leaving the fire to burn down to embers, and slipped away into the thickest part of the forest, moving north toward the rocky, broken country where horses would be of little use. For 2 days they moved in silence, eating cold jerky and sleeping in short, restless shifts. On the 3rd day they found the scout. He was lying at the bottom of a shallow ravine, his neck broken at an odd angle. His horse was gone, and his rifle was nowhere to be seen. But clutched in his cold, dead hand was a piece of paper. A wanted poster. Noah pried it from the man's fingers. His own face stared back at him, a crude charcoal sketch that was both him and not him. Beneath it the words were stark and brutal. Wanted. Federal fugitive known as Jesse or Eli, for the murder of Corporal Miller, for incitement of the Comanche tribes, to be considered armed and extremely dangerous. $500 reward, dead or alive. And at the bottom, a signature. Captain J. Thorne, U.S. Army. "Murder?" Noah whispered, the word tasting like poison. "Incitement?" He had never spoken to another Comanche besides Clara. It was all a lie designed to make him a monster in the eyes of the world, a monster that anyone could kill without question. Clara looked at the poster, her eyes hard. "This Captain Thorne," she said. "He is not a man of law. He is a man with a secret. He is not hunting you to bring you to justice. He is hunting you to silence you." The realization dawned on Noah like a cold, terrible sunrise. The ranchers, the cavalry, the murder charge. It wasn't about a stolen horse. It had never been about a stolen horse. It was about something he had seen, something he knew, or maybe something he had. He thought back to that last chaotic night at the ranch. The yelling, the drinking. The rancher, a man named Sterling, had been arguing with a visitor, a man in a uniform, Captain Thorne. They were arguing over a small, leather-bound ledger. Sterling was drunk, waving it around. Thorne was trying to get it back. There was a struggle, a gunshot. It wasn't a corporal who had been shot. It was Sterling, the ranch owner, and Thorne was the one who pulled the trigger. In the confusion, as Thorne's men grabbed him, Noah had acted on instinct. He'd snatched the ledger off the floor and shoved it deep into his bedroll just before they dragged him outside and tied him to that fence. He hadn't even known what it was. He just knew it was important, and he still had it. It was wrapped in an oilcloth at the very bottom of his small pack. "I know why," Noah said, his voice barely audible. "I know why he's hunting me. I saw him. He killed his own partner. And I think I have the proof." Suddenly, everything shifted. They were no longer just running for their lives. They were carrying a truth that could destroy a powerful man, a man who would stop at nothing, kill anyone to keep it buried. Their journey was no longer an escape. It had become a race to expose Thorne before he could bury them, and his secret forever. Clara looked at the grim determination on Noah's face. The boy she had cut from the fence was gone. In his place was a man with a purpose. "Then we do not run from the wolf," she said, her voice quiet but fierce. "We find a way to break his teeth." They were no longer the hunted. They were now the hunters. And they would use the wilderness, the very land Thorne saw as his enemy, as their greatest weapon. The captain thought he was chasing a scared boy and an old woman. He had no idea he was walking into a trap that had been set for him decades ago by a land that never forgot, and a people that refused to be erased. They traveled for a week, pushing deeper into the Badlands, a maze of canyons and sheer rock faces where Thorne's cavalry would be forced to dismount and follow on foot. It was Clara's territory. Every rock, every twisted juniper tree was an old friend. She taught Noah how to walk without leaving a trail, how to use the echoes of the canyon to make two people sound like 20, how to find water where it seemed there was only dry stone. They were ghosts, always ahead, always out of reach. They left false trails that led to dead-end canyons and hornet nests. They doubled back on their own tracks, watching from high ledges as Thorne's men cursed and struggled below. The hunters were becoming the haunted. One evening they watched as Thorne, his face red with frustration and sunburn, savagely beat one of his men for losing their trail. It was then that Noah understood. Thorne wasn't leading an army. He was leading a pack of dogs held together only by fear, and fear could be used. "We need to separate them," Noah whispered to Clara as they lay hidden behind a cluster of boulders. Clara nodded. "A pack is strong. A lone wolf is just hungry." That night, they put their plan into action. Noah, using the skills Clara had taught him, crept down into the cavalry's camp. He didn't sprinkle powder this time. He did something much simpler. He cut the tethers on 3 of their horses, slapping them hard on the rump and sending them galloping off into the darkness. The next morning, the camp was in chaos. 3 soldiers were now on foot. Thorne, enraged, made a fatal mistake. He split his men. He sent a small group of 5, led by his most trusted sergeant, to track the horses, while he and the main force would continue the hunt for Noah. It was exactly what they had been waiting for. Clara and Noah shadowed the smaller group. They waited until the soldiers were deep in a narrow, winding canyon. Then, from the cliffs high above, they started a rock slide. Not a huge, deadly one, but big enough to block the canyon path behind them, trapping them. Panic erupted. The soldiers, now cut off from Thorne, drew their rifles, firing wildly at the shadows on the cliffs above. Stay here, Noah told Clara, pressing the precious ledger into her hands. Keep this safe. Before she could protest, he was gone, scrambling down a hidden game trail on the other side of the canyon, a plan forming in his mind. It was a terrible, desperate plan, but it was the only one he had. He circled around behind the trapped soldiers, using the terrain to stay hidden. He could hear them arguing, their fear making them angry. He waited, patiently. As dusk began to fall, the sergeant made the decision to make camp in the canyon, hoping Thorn would find them in the morning. That was his second mistake. Under the cover of darkness, Noah moved. He took them one by one, not to kill them, to disarm them. A snare that whipped a rifle up into a tree, a tripwire that sent a man tumbling into a thicket of thorns, a silent takedown from behind, leaving a soldier bound and gagged with his own belt. He moved like a spirit of the canyon, using their fear and the darkness as his allies. By the time the moon was high, only the sergeant was left, huddled by the dying fire, his pistol in his hand, jumping at every sound. Noah stepped out of the shadows, his bow drawn, an arrow aimed directly at the man's heart. The sergeant scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with terror. "Who are you?" he stammered. "The man you're hunting," Noah said, his voice calm and steady. "Drop the gun." The sergeant hesitated, his pistol wavering. "I don't want to kill you," Noah said, his voice echoing slightly in the canyon. "I want you to take a message to your captain." Slowly, the sergeant placed his pistol on the ground. "Tell him the boy he left for dead is waiting for him," Noah said. "Tell him I know what was in the ledger. Tell him to meet me, alone, at the place called the Weeping Stones, at dawn. If he doesn't come alone, his secret dies with me, and you will never find me." Noah watched as the sergeant, pale and shaken, nodded his understanding. Then Noah melted back into the darkness, leaving the man alone with his disarmed and disgruntled soldiers. He had done it. He had turned the tables. He had stopped running and had set his own trap. He climbed back up the cliffs to where Clara was waiting, the ledger held tightly in her hands. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face in the moonlight. The fear was gone. The uncertainty was gone. "You have your name now," she said softly. He nodded, the word feeling true and solid in his chest. "Noah, Noah," she repeated, and it sounded like a prayer. Now all they could do was wait for the dawn, and for the wolf to walk into their trap. But Captain Thorn was more cunning and more ruthless than they knew. He had no intention of coming alone, and he had no intention of letting either of them leave the Weeping Stones alive. The Weeping Stones was a place of legend, a circle of tall, slender rocks that, after a rain, seemed to bleed water down their dark surfaces. Clara led Noah there through a series of hidden paths, arriving hours before dawn. It was a natural fortress, with only one clear entrance and a commanding view of the surrounding plains. "He will not come alone," Clara stated, her eyes scanning the horizon. It wasn't a guess. It was a fact. Men like Thorn did not believe in honor, only in overwhelming force. "I know," Noah said. He pointed to a narrow crevice high up on the canyon wall, opposite the entrance. "I'll be there. You stay hidden, no matter what happens." "The land will fight with you," she said, placing a hand on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him with such open affection. "Listen to it." As the first pale light of dawn painted the sky, they saw him. Thorn, riding a big black horse, emerged from the morning mist. And just as they predicted, he was not alone. Hidden in the rocks on either side of the canyon entrance, Noah could see the glint of rifle barrels. At least 10 men, maybe more, lay in ambush. Thorn rode into the center of the stone circle and dismounted, his arrogance a tangible thing. "Boy," he shouted, his voice echoing off the stones, "you wanted a meeting. Here I am. Show yourself and give me what is mine." Noah did not show himself. Instead, an arrow whizzed out of the shadows and embedded itself in the dust just inches from Thorn's boot. Thorn jumped back, his hand flying to his pistol. "Tricks, I should have known," he snarled. "You wanted to meet alone, Captain," Noah's voice called out, seeming to come from the rocks themselves. "You lied." "I am the law here," Thorn roared. "My men are my law. Now give me the book." "First, you tell me why," Noah's voice demanded. "Why did you kill Sterling? What was in that ledger?" Thorn laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You're a dead man asking questions you can't understand. That book detailed every illegal land grab, every government contract I skimmed from, every life I bought and sold from here to the capital. It was my fortune, my legacy, and a half-breed stable boy is not going to take it from me." It was the confession Noah needed. But he knew Thorn wasn't just talking to him. He was talking to his hidden men, giving them a target. "Now!" Thorn screamed, diving for cover as he drew his pistol. The world exploded in gunfire. Bullets ricocheted off the weeping stones, chipping away fragments of rock. Noah, perched in his high crevice, was pinned down. He was a good shot with a bow, but he couldn't fight 10 rifles. But he wasn't alone. From the other side of the canyon, a single piercing cry echoed through the air. It was an old sound, a sound of defiance and war. "Clara." Then, from the canyon floor, smoke began to rise, thick, choking smoke. Clara had spent the pre-dawn hours piling damp leaves and pungent herbs at the base of the canyon walls. Using a small flint and steel, she had lit them. The wind, which always flowed through the canyon at dawn, now pushed the dense smoke directly into the positions of Thorn's hidden riflemen. They began to cough, their eyes streaming. Their shots went wild. The ambush was broken. Thorn, enraged, saw Clara's lone figure through the smoke and fired at her. But she was already gone, disappearing back into the rocks like a ghost. The distraction was all Noah needed. He dropped down from his crevice, moving swiftly along the base of the cliffs, circling behind the panicked soldiers. He was no longer a boy hiding. He was a hunter. He moved with a purpose that was both terrifying and beautiful. He took them down with the hard edge of his bow, with a thrown rock, with a speed and ferocity born of desperation and rage. Soon only Thorn was left, standing in the center of the smoky clearing, his pistol empty, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. Noah stepped out from behind one of the stones, his own bow drawn, the arrow pointed steadily at Thorn's chest. "It's over, Thorn," Noah said, his voice hard as the rock around them. Thorn stared at him, his chest heaving. You're nothing," he spat. "A filthy half-breed. You think anyone will believe you? I'll hunt you down. I'll tell them you massacred my men." "No," a new voice said. "He won't." The sergeant, the one Noah had spared in the canyon, stepped out from the entrance, his rifle leveled at Thorn. Behind him were the other 4 soldiers Noah had disarmed. They had heard everything, every word of Thorn's confession. "It's over, Captain," the sergeant said, his voice filled with disgust. "You're under arrest." Thorn's face twisted into a snarl of pure hatred. He looked from the sergeant to Noah, and in a final act of spite he lunged, not at the soldiers, but at Noah. Noah didn't have time to shoot. He just reacted, sidestepping the lunge and bringing his heavy bow down in a powerful arc against the side of Thorn's head. The captain crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Silence descended upon the weeping stones, broken only by the crackle of the smoldering leaves and the whisper of the wind. Noah stood over the fallen captain, his whole body trembling with the aftermath of the fight. He had faced the wolf, and he had not broken. He handed the ledger to the sergeant. "This will tell you the rest," he said. The sergeant took it, nodding grimly. "The reward on your head is rescinded. Your name is cleared. You're free to go." Noah looked around at the canyon, at the sky, at Clara as she emerged from the rocks. Free. It was a word he was only just beginning to understand. He walked over to Clara. He had no words. He just reached out and took her hand. She squeezed it tightly. Together they turned their backs on the soldiers and the broken man they were arresting and walked away, disappearing back into the wildlands that had saved them. They had won not just their lives, but their truth. And for a boy who started with nothing, that was everything. Years stretched into seasons, and seasons bloomed into a quiet lifetime. The boy who once lay broken against a fence no longer looked like a boy at all. Noah grew into his body the way a tree grows into a stone crevice, strong, steady, and unyielding. His shoulders widened, his voice deepened, and his movements carried the quiet, powerful confidence of someone who had learned both hardship and grace. Wherever he went, he left a small sign carved into the bark of a tree, a circle with a single straight line drawn through it. On cottonwoods by the river, on cedars along the high ridges, on the smooth white trunks of aspens in the hidden groves, each mark carried the same silent message. Someone lives here who refuses to die in silence. For Noah, it was more than just a mark. It was a declaration, a promise that he had claimed his place in the world and that his story would not be erased. It was by one such marked grove, while fishing with a spear he had carved himself, that he met Kaya. She was gathering berries in a worn basket, her hair a wild tangle of black, and her laugh was as sharp and clear as the creek water. Where Noah was measured and quiet, she was restless and curious. She teased him about his solemn face, then returned the next day with more questions, her bright eyes missing nothing. Noah, who had once believed he would walk the earth alone forever, found himself listening more than speaking, and then, to his surprise, speaking more than he ever had in his life. Kaya began to linger, and before long she chose to follow him back to the cedar grove where he and Clara had made their home. Clara, sitting by the fire one evening, watched the two young people laugh together over the smoke of roasting fish. She did not interfere. She only smiled, a small, quiet curve of her lips, as if a weight she had carried for decades had finally, blessedly, been set down. But time does not linger for the living. Clara's hair, once as black as a raven's feather, had long since turned to the white of winter snow. Her steps slowed, her voice grew softer, but her presence, her spirit, remained as sharp as the last brushstroke on a nearly finished painting. Noah watched her more carefully in those days, fetching her water without being asked, tending the snares so she could rest her tired bones. Kaya, too, began to care for her, weaving soft sleeping mats from river reeds and preparing the herbal teas the way Clara had once done for Noah. Still, Clara never complained. She never asked for a thing. She had lived her life with a powerful silence, and now she prepared to leave it in the same way. One evening, as the fire glowed orange against the hide walls of their lodge, Clara called Noah to her side. Her hand, once so strong and sure, trembled slightly as she reached for his. "I am ready to go," she whispered, her voice a faint rustle of leaves. He swallowed hard, a painful lump forming in his throat. "Where?" Her smile was faint, fragile, but it reached her eyes. "To wherever the buffalo go when they are no longer hunted." Tears blurred his vision. "Clara," he began, but she lifted her hand weakly to stop him. "Don't name it," she said. "Just hold my hand, that's enough." So he did. All through the long night he sat by her side and held her hand in his, listening as her breaths grew lighter, more uneven, until finally they stopped altogether. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and the dawn spilled a pale, gentle light into the silent lodge. When he finally leaned down to kiss her forehead, her skin was cool, but her fingers were still faintly warm within his own. They buried her beneath a cliff of red rock, a place where the canyons sang with the wind each morning, and the tall grasses swayed like a great, green river. Noah carved a simple flat stone to mark the place. It bore no mention of Comanche or woman or mother. It read only, "She gave me back to myself." Noah stood before that stone with Kaya's hand in his, the old necklace Clara had given him resting against his chest. He understood now. Family was not something written in blood. It was written in choices. Her choice to save him. His choice to stay. Their choice to belong to one another. And with that, Clara's story on this earth ended. But her gift endured. She had taken a broken boy with no name and had given the world back a man who knew exactly who he was. Years passed, and Clara's grave beneath the red cliffs grew wild with tall grass and bright flowers. But the story of the woman who saved a nameless boy lived on, not in books or in ledgers, but in the quiet work of the man she left behind. Travelers on the lonely trails began to whisper stories of him, a half-wild man who lived in the deep forests, tall and steady as an oak, who would appear as if from nowhere to help mend a broken wagon wheel, to soothe a sick animal, or to guide a lost child safely back to their mother's arms. Some said he was a ghost, others called him strange. But those few who had been invited to sit by his fire, who had tasted the stew from his pot, or heard the low, calm hum of his voice, they knew the truth. He was Noah, the boy who once had no name, now the man who gave others back to themselves. And in the hush of the deep woods, when the wind moved through the leaves just right, you could almost hear Clara's voice, whispering on the breeze, "He belongs." What do you think drove Captain Thorne to such extreme lengths? Was it just greed, or was it something more? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more tales from the forgotten corners of history.